This week, the controversial series from Mark Russell and Richard Pace, published by Ahoy Comics. Jesus teamed up with a superhero. What was the thought behind that pairing? What are the meaty points of the story, and which are just going for low-hanging fruit? What more could happen in the second series, or should happen? Will Weaver joins me to discuss Second Coming. First, just a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon, and make that your bookmark for future purchases. Deconstructing Comics earns a bit of money from your purchase that helps us keep the show going. We really appreciate your support. This is Tim.
This is Will.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo with Will in, I forget, Ohio somewhere. Remind me.
Sunny Cleveland. It's a destination city, the Paris of Lake Erie, Cleveland, Ohio.
Okay, in Cleveland. All right. Great. Yeah, so Will's been on a few times before. And so I was looking for something else to talk with him about, and I thought that Second Coming would be a good one to look at. Written by Mark Russell, who has become kind of well known for being assigned to 6 to 12 issue series starring licensed characters and kind of making them his own, most notably the Flintstones. But he had a Snagglepuss series and Wonder Twins more recently. I have not read those. I read Flintstones. Have you read much of his work?
No, this was my first introduction, and it made quite an impression on me.
Okay. Now, this series, as it is, does star Jesus Christ and a superhero called Sunstar, made it kind of automatically controversial. This was originally supposed to be published by Vertigo, which of course is part of DC, and they loved it, he says, but they wanted to make some changes to it, and there were going to be some delays also, and so he thought, rather than have to make significant changes, he wanted to stick to the vision and get it out right away. So he and the artist Richard Pace asked for the rights back, and they took it to Ahoy Comics. And so it came out. And Russell has explored the Bible before. I've actually had a PDF of it forever that I think the publisher sent me to review of a book called God is Disappointed in You, which was a prose book. It had some kind of illustrations in it, but it was not a comic. I heard somewhere that Mark Russell had gone to seminary, but I couldn't confirm that. It's not mentioned on his Wikipedia page. Yeah,
I believe that.
Yeah, it seems likely. Yeah, well, why do you say that?
Well, in looking at ways to approach this, I want to throw my biases out there immediately, and superlatives aside, this was my favorite comic of the last 10 years.
Wow.
Absolutely intrigued me, and the Vertigo connection, like to increase my superlatives, it felt and read like a 90s Vertigo title.
Mm-hmm.
And it's too bad they passed on it, because it would have been beautiful under that brand. It almost would have been a Vertigo renaissance, or at least a flashback to the golden era.
Mm-hmm.
But in looking for a topic to glom onto, to sort of structure a conversation about this work, in flipping through some of the text in the front page and the back page, he talks about the controversy. He's almost apologizing. But what occurs to me is he is actually doing theology.
Yeah.
In a scholarly and almost a humble sense. And I wanted to make sure that I was on target here, so I actually looked up several definitions of theology, and there's some long ones and there's some short ones, but a short one that I think fairly captures the spirit of this piece is the study of God and God's relationship to creation.
Mm-hmm.
And it really is about God's relationship to creation, or the many faces of God in the Christian pantheon. I know I'm mixing faith systems here, but the language feels right. So I would address this piece as a legitimate, informed work of theology.
Yes. Yeah, it's informed, but still at the same time, it feels... at times, I felt like he was changing things a little bit in order... Well, there was one part in particular where I felt like he was kind of fudging, where Jesus is, doing the Sermon on the Mount, and he says, you've heard an eye for an eye, for a tooth for a tooth, but I say turn the other cheek. And some guys in the crowd who, from their clothes, I'm guessing they're probably Pharisees or something. And one of them says, what did he say? And the other one says, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And the first guy says, that sounds reasonable, something like that. Which, makes sense that, people misinterpret what he said. But the framing of that was that, Jesus has gotten a look at a New Testament and he's shocked at how they got his message wrong in the New Testament, even though what the speech that he's giving there is
accurately conveyed by the New Testament.
Right, yeah. So the New Testament didn't get it wrong, according to this, but he's sort of saying that it did at the same time. So I was a little...
Oh, it's far from a perfect work, and he certainly takes swings at some low balls, which I thought were on the nose and maybe not necessarily too much worth the reader's time. Mm-hmm. But and the most, as far as I'm concerned, the most controversial thing in this entire piece is he has Jesus essentially dismiss the New Testament as the work of a dude he doesn't know, namely Paul.
Yeah,
it's like, Paul, never heard of that guy. I didn't tell him to spread my word. So that is most assuredly going to go down poorly with faithful Christians, to say the least. But what makes me return to the idea of this as a piece of theology worthy of consideration on those merits is his conceptualizations of the difference between his take on a faith relationship versus, I guess, his critique of an Old Testament version, which was, and this appears in two issues. I think it's in the first and the third, so it's definitely something that the author wants us to remember. This is the place where the author drops the narrative and speaks directly to the audience, where he says, people believe in God just because they want someone to be a witness to their pain. Mm-hmm. And he says it, I think, as a critique of humanity, that it's somehow hollow or based in some kind of base loneliness. And I think that there's more compassion to be found in that statement than that. There's something very human about hoping there's a witness to our pain, that our suffering, if not made better, at least isn't unknown.
Yeah, and it's kind of validated.
Absolutely. And his Christ figure, his Jesus, says, well, I thought I could provide a solution. I could teach people to, rather than be the witnesses to one another's pain, to provide a means to solve one another's pain. Again, that's very lofty, but the way he portrays both God and Jesus as characters, I think, are built to serve his philosophical conceptions of the contrast that he wishes the narrative to illustrate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, he seems to be trying to explain, the Old Testament God is, the more and vengeful God, the eye for an eye God. And in the New Testament, it's more about, forgiveness and that. And so he seems to be, to explain that by saying God is always the kind of tough guy. And he, like at the end of the Old Testament, essentially gives up on humans. So Jesus says in this that he went to earth to teach people to help each other because they couldn't rely on God to help them anymore. It's an interesting way to look at it. I'm not sure. That might be a little bit of a controversial thing to say also, but
maybe so. And there's sort of an apologia for God in his conversations with Sunstar. Sunstar is kicking himself for failure to save people. And God says, I try and help them, and people die. And it shows the ark bringing down the walls of Jericho. And he says, or I don't help them, and people die, and he stops sending manna in the desert. So no matter what I do, I can't by my action or my inaction remove the reality of suffering and death.
Yeah. Well, since you mentioned Sunstar, I wasn't quite sure. I didn't quite get the point of putting the two of them together until I looked it up in an interview. But before I read that here, what was your sense of the reason for pairing Jesus and a superhero?
I think there's a lot of reasons to do so, and my initial impression was kind of right. That I'll tell you, when this book was announced, I thought that I was just going to skip it, and I didn't really want to look at reading it until you suggested I do so. So one, thanks for that, because I obviously really enjoyed the book. But my thought was, again, this is too on the nose. Jesus is, the man of the future, a god among mortals, imbued with superpowers, a mythical hero. He's putting Jesus on the continuum of super beings, from Christianity to gods of Olympus to today's superhero pantheon. You could see Samuel Jackson's character, Mr. Glass, and Unbreakable, perfectly outlining the mythical reasons to put Christ in that hall of justice, so to speak. So I thought it would be to compare and contrast a violence-based superhero versus a compassion-based superhero. And I was pleased that that's not the way it played. But
Okay. Well, the fact that Sunstar is a violence-based superhero is part of what Russell mentions in this interview. This was actually with a guy named Chad Burdett for the Albany Times-Union. It was not a comics press at all. It was just a plain old newspaper. But Russell says, Second Coming is the story of Jesus Christ returning to Earth during the age of superheroes and being appalled by what he finds. It's really inspired by two things. First, the idea that in politics and pop culture, we are programmed to look to physical force as the solution to every problem because it's the one good thing we as a nation and as storytellers are good at. Because we have a massive military and have invested so many resources into mass incarceration, these are the solutions we tend to use to solve problems, even if they end up making them worse. And even when superheroes are fighting for good causes, the message behind them seems to be that every problem has a violent answer and that we should be constantly paranoid about people plotting our doom. I wanted to do a comic that clapped back this embedded ideology in our national mythos and our popular storytelling. Secondly, I wanted to write a story about how far afield modern Christianity, specifically the evangelical Christianity I grew up with, has strayed from the actual teachings of Christ. And yeah, on the first point, Sunstar is excessively violent in how he fights villains, and well, in the first issue, accidentally kills some, although we don't know that till the second issue. And in other cases, apparently also kills people. And his girlfriend, Sheila, just sort of tut-tuts that. She doesn't like it, but she doesn't, like, dump him in horror. She's like, I don't really like you murdering people. But then she just kind of forgives him. But, yeah, I mean, that's certainly... And Sunstar, I don't know, he seems sort of conflicted about that, or... he didn't mean to kill people, but he also killed people in the name of justice. I don't know. What do you think about him?
I was almost expecting the lead character from The Boys, whose name is escaping me at the moment. But instead, Sunstar seems to come off really like a sad sack.
Mm-hmm.
That his excessive violence is a means of filling some gap in his own heart that he can't otherwise contend with.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know that there's all that much knowledge or insight to be gleaned from the character of Sunstar, but I was surprised that his portrayal was one more of kind of a lost soul rather than a hyper-confident narcissist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, he'll kind of go off and, get all emboldened by some injustice that he perceives, and then discovers after he's beaten the crap out of somebody that he was mistaken. And then he's like, oh, geez. And he's going to the support group with other superheroes. And the other superheroes, we find out, don't actually like him. The one guy in particular declares when Sunstar's not there that he's so jealous of Sunstar. And then when Sunstar asks for his help, then he's sure, yeah, I'll help you. So.
Yeah, that was odd too. That maybe their sour grapes was just because they wanted to be a part of his world and share in his glory and his heroism.
Mm-hmm.
But that character projects this tremendous vibe of futility.
Mm-hmm.
That his extraordinary power doesn't allow him to make an extraordinary contribution, or doesn't allow him to move the needle in a way where he can create a difference that makes a difference. It's always back to the same old.
Mm-hmm.
However, his solution to the supervillain was a pretty good one, in my opinion.
Well, which one? The one that he dropped off in Greenland?
No, the one that he sent to community college.
Oh yeah, the teenage one. Right, yeah. In that case, that he wasn't so violent. He decided instead to, I guess he's paying for it to send him to community college, and he wouldn't let him take an art course either. It had to be something practical.
See, I think he was being truly sadistic there.
Yes.
Certainly not without a mean streak.
No. What did he end up taking? Engineering or something?
I think it was introduction to business.
Yeah, something business.
Coming up, the two different art styles in Second Coming, the interesting characterization of Satan, is Russell's Jesus giving up nonviolence, and more. Recently, I'm extra busy with freelance work and job hunting, so our podcast will experience rolling blackouts over the next few weeks. This week, the bi-weekly To the Bat Polls will miss one episode, and we intend to be back on February 20th. On February 19th, Deconstructing Comics will take a week off. And on Patreon, Tim Catches Up with the MCU will skip February 15th and return February 29th to discuss Captain Marvel. However, there's no rest from republishing classic episodes of Deconstructing Comics, unlocked by our patrons' generous support. This week's classic episode, number 72, from April 23, 2007, features a discussion of Scott McCloud's Making Comics. I'm joined by both Brandon and Mulele. It's actually part 2 of the discussion. Part 1 will go up next week. This episode focuses on McCloud's idea of 4 tribes of comics creators. The classic episodes can be found on our Facebook and Twitter feeds by clicking on the earliest months listed on the left sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com or in publicly available posts on our Patreon page, or in the Patreon smartphone app. Classic episodes have been unlocked back to number 46. You can help to unlock earlier episodes by pledging. Check out all our goals and help us reach them at patreon.com/deconcomics.
You like cheap comic books, right? Well, I'm Professor Allen, and I talk about cheap comic books on the Quarterbin Podcast. In every episode, I'll dissect a single comic from my collection, as long as I paid no more than 25 cents for the issue. Forget about $4 new comics that you can read in 4 minutes, or crossover events that can cost $100 to collect. Join me in the Quarterbin, where even bad comics are a bargain, and good ones are a steal. The Quarterbin Podcast is part of the Relatively Geeky Podcast Network. Visit us at relativelygeekypodcast.blogspot.com or search Relatively Geeky or Quarterbin Podcast in iTunes. I guarantee it'll be worth every penny.
There are two different art styles running through this. So on the pages that are, as according to the credits, on Earth, that are more kind of cartoony, they have Leonard Kirk doing finishes on them and Andy Troy coloring. And, those look more kind of like standard comic book art. Maybe a little, turn to 11, this is comic book art kind of feeling. And then in scenes that are in heaven, or even if they're on Earth and they just include God, Jesus, and or Satan, they're drawn in a more kind of sketchy, kind of not so comics type of style. And I wasn't quite sure what the reason was for having the two different art styles. I guess sort of the contrast of this is the comic book world and this is the Bible world. Did you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think the contrast is more noticeable when they would do the very sweeping wide shots. One thing I did notice about the art style is a lot of different, now I'm pulling up my film vocabulary, but a lot of interesting camera angles, that a lot of the scenes took place where you were slightly above the action and looking down on it at a little bit of a gentle angle. And it's very Hitchcockian. That kind of looking down angle is sort of intended to telegraph a feel of fatality, that you're looking from a distance at players who are setting something in motion that may be outside of their control. I liked that. I thought it was interesting to see those styles. And there's, I think, when God takes Sunstar to heaven and to the food court of defunct restaurants.
Yes.
Like that looked very Vertigo, quite frankly. It felt like I just cracked open a middle 90s issue of Sandman, so.
Right, yeah. When Sunstar goes to heaven to have a meeting with God, that's in the sort of biblical art style. But yeah, that was great with the defunct restaurants. Wow, I didn't realize Chi-Chi's was out of business.
Yeah, I had to find out the hard way too.
When I was in college, that was the place to go. Let's go to Chi-Chi's for margaritas.
But I did mourn Kenny Rogers Roasters and Burger Chef.
Burger Chef, I remember. I think the Kenny Rogers, I think I was in Japan by that time, so I still think of Kenny Rogers as just a singer.
No. His sides were good.
But I feel like a lot of this, in that bit I read there, Russell's talking about having been brought up as an evangelical, and I feel like he and what's the artist's name? Richard Pace, are kind of intentionally tweaking the people, tweaking the evangelicals with, like God's dropping the F-bomb and Adam and Eve are actually screwing in a flashback. And he just seems to be kind of, and, Adam is, you get some full frontals here and there. Just seemed like he was, really trying to make them angry.
Yeah, there's certainly some thumbing of the nose. The most bad poke in the eye, in my opinion, again being the call out on Paul.
But that's assuming that the evangelicals will actually read it rather than just protesting against it. But
yeah, they would have to pick the thing up in order to get mad. But if that was the author's intention, like if he was motivated just to like lash out against like factors of his upbringing, like I would find that disappointing. Quite honestly, evangelicals have been beaten up so badly over the last 20 years. At this point, those hits are just like noise. I filter them out because I heard it all before. It's background noise that I could literally get anywhere. The content for me was in some of these other ideas which I found were intriguing, which I'm not getting anywhere else. So like if he had to get to them by some roundabout like evening of the scales between his childhood experience,
well, I mean,
I'm happy to pick and choose the things that resonate.
Well, even just in the first issue, I mean, I was trying to take issue by issue notes here, getting ready for this podcast, and just in the first issue, it's like, well, there's this point and this point. I don't feel like putting all that in my notes. Might as well just copy the whole comic into my notes. It just seems like every page there's another kind of point that he's trying to make.
Yeah, but there's some that stand out. I also thought an intriguing take was his characterization of Satan.
Yeah.
And Satan's relationship with both God and Jesus, because you see Satan is motivated more by jealousy than anything else. That it was a malice born of envy. And that's something that I think certainly rings as authentic to the scriptures, but is not necessarily emphasized. So I like that there was this emphasis placed on a point that I think is clear from the source material, but which is not the most overtly stressed piece. And I liked that Satan was the one person in the whole piece that Jesus wanted nothing to do with. It's like, man, I know where you're coming from. I've been around this before with you once already. But God was open to sitting down and talking to Satan, even though he's like on the bubble about destroying the earth.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, God doesn't want Jesus to get killed again on earth, and he's decided if Jesus gets killed again, he'll just destroy everything.
Yes, that is it's a test of humanity rather than a test of Jesus's divinity. Which in ways I think is not it's not an inappropriate interpretation of the Gospels either.
What are some other points that jumped out at you?
I'm interested in seeing how this shakes out. I don't know what the intention is with regards to how long the series is going to run, if they had visualized a beginning, a middle, and an end to the story.
Right, yeah, so these 6 issues came out as kind of the first season, and I guess later there's going to be more, but...
Yeah, I almost felt like this should be a limited series that is scoped with a specific end date in time, because the future adventures of Jesus and Sunstar will lose its freshness quickly.
Yeah, I thought so too. I don't think they can make this last that much longer.
And 6 issues would have been a good run. They could probably wrap it up in 8 and say everything that needs saying. But I'm going to assume there's going to be another 6 at least before they decide to call it a day.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at the end, one thing that we've got at the end is Jesus kind of questioning his whole philosophy, because he's spoiler alert, he was faced with being killed by Satan, stabbed by Satan, and in kind of self-defense, he stabbed Satan, and Satan died. And now Jesus is thinking maybe just violence is the only way there is to get along in the world. That I was completely wrong about all the forgiveness stuff. So it's kind of a disheartening way to end it as far as Jesus's character arc is concerned.
I think it could go either way. I think when Jesus was criticizing Sunstar's abusive behavior, I think the line was something to the effect of, like, violence is the only tool that you know how to use. But he didn't come out and say it's an illegitimate tool. So they may have inserted in the narrative a little bit of a foundation for a character arc there. It'd certainly be a broad arc if they're going to try and turn Jesus into the Punisher, but I can't see.
Yeah, I can't quite picture that, but well, one place where it took me a while, but I got the symbolism. So it's the end of issue 4 going into issue 5, God and Satan meet at a restaurant near the old Checkpoint Charlie between East and West Berlin. And I could see he was making kind of a parallel there between where kind of the meeting of the Western democracies and communism and the meeting of God and Satan. It was kind of an interesting parallel.
Yeah, I enjoyed that scene quite a bit. I quite liked the portrayal of God throughout this, and again, I thought it was a different kind of take,
kind of a crabby old man,
one that had a lot of energy. Like there was an effervescence every time God was on the page that the rest of the characters didn't contribute. And the art style in that scene reminded me quite a bit of an art style from another 90s title that was Martial Law, which is another giant critique of the superhero genre, also extremely on the nose in its criticisms. But the combination of very, very bright colors and very textured grunge at the same time, where the bright things were like super surreal, and the dirt and the crud were also very surreal, but also front and center. It's like this U-shaped experience of the most cheerful and the most gross that fit that scene well. I thought that was a moment where form and content harmonized quite nicely.
Yeah, I'm going back to take a look at it. Now, did you notice in that section, so when God comes in, he's wearing that kind of trucker hat that says "I'm sorry" on it with a rainbow behind it, which ends up being an anticipation of what his response is going to be to, Satan's request to kind of be forgiven and let back into heaven, because he sends his message exactly that way, where he says, I'll send you a message next time it rains, and it's a rainbow with "I'm sorry" written on it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like that response was preordained. That was how he was always going to respond to Satan.
Yeah, for sure. The use of the rainbow symbolism there was pretty profound, and the notion of having God apologize to Satan is also rather challenging.
Yeah, it's not like it's a rainbow with a middle finger on it. It's "I'm sorry."
Exactly. But let me say, like this is a concept that is certain to offend, and I'm probably offended by it myself, but it's so well executed in that scene, and it requires the reader to formulate a response. You can't just like hoover that in through your eye sockets and then just eject it and not think about it again. However you feel about it, it cannot go unnoticed. And it's one of those great little artistic things that is achievable in comics that is not so much achievable in any other genre, that keeps comics vital. It really is a roadblock. You cannot just go around it. You got to climb over it. It takes effort. It's not light reading.
Yeah. Okay. What else can we talk about here? Something else that jumped out at you?
I liked the tone overall. There are some inconsistencies. Some I think are intentional, and I think some are not. There's a lot of melancholy dwelling interspersed with very quickly paced, almost like hyperactive moments. And a lot of them I think are probably intentional. And some of the differences in the quality of the content, I think, are just based on the interest of the author. Like, there's things in here where he wants to get to certain points that he wants to make and is not quite as invested in the connective tissue to get there.
Well, and then he always kind of mixes in this goofy humor with, his serious points. I think that's sort of a trademark of his. And it's always kind of a challenge because, like, okay, this is a goofy joke, but is it just a goofy joke? Is he trying to say something with this too? And I'm never quite sure if I'm missing a serious point, behind the goofy joke.
I think that the goofy joke is almost an apology for trying to give you the heavy duty point, or it's the sugar coating around the bitter center, or maybe it's just an attempted contrast. Frankly, I don't know, but it's the sense of gradation is not there. It's very much you've got syrup and you've got vinegar, and not that much in between. That could just be a stylistic thing. I gotta ask, what in the holy heck was the Flintstones about? I can't imagine the continuum from the adventures of Bedrock to the adventures of Heaven.
Well, so he kind of just used the characters to make some of his own points. I remember there was one case where, it was a lot of kind of social commentary. Particularly, I remember him doing, in part of an issue, it was about kind of how gay people fit into the community, and they were sort of looked at as helpers, caretakers, that they nurturers, because they couldn't have children themselves biologically, but they were there to support the community. I remember that point. It was kind of a grab bag of social commentary on a lot of different topics, but the fact that it was the Flintstones was just sort of the window dressing, I think.
Gotcha. Well, I did not find this piece overly pedantic. I think maybe if I had read the Flintstones, I might have been more sensitized to those inclinations by the author. But coming at it cold, I think there was a good balance between, like, I didn't feel him reaching through the page and grabbing me by the shirt and like, shouting in my face. It was more soft-handed than that. Yeah,
and the humor cushions that also. Another thing we could talk about is how the point's made several times that God didn't pay very much attention to Jesus when he was growing up. He was kind of a latchkey kid, and even when I think when Jesus has some followers in modern Earth, they're calling it Church of Jesus Latchkey Kid.
Yeah.
I wonder what that seemed like a kind of an odd point that God was kind of an absent parent. I mean, that's certainly not the impression you get from the Bible, but maybe that was sort of his explanation for why Jesus' philosophy was so different from God's.
Maybe. I think, like, at one point, God says to Sunstar, I'm an idea man. Like, he's not about execution. And in life, you meet people like that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, folks who can, visualize a system or a world or a universe.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, because the way that he talks about Earth to other people, like in flashbacks where he's doing creation, he's talking about it like it's the iPod or something. Like, this is my latest thing. What do you think of this?
Sure, he's exploding with creativity and inspiration, but when the inspiration for that newest creation is gone, inspiration for something else moves on, and the old creation is abandoned. And for the creative people, of artistic people, those who we may be, or those in our lives who we may have to interface with, I think that is a reality. That when inspiration leaves, it's replaced with sudden indifference.
Expand on that a little bit.
Well, if one is filled with enough passion that they're going to stop what they're doing and bring something that's never been seen before to life, whether it's a comic book or a planet, write a song, create a podcast, that takes energy. It takes a rush of self-created inertia. But when it's gone, then you move on to the next thing. Or when inspiration for the next thing appears, you can only act on one at a time. There is a fickleness to creation that I think is a fact of humanity that crosses time and culture. And to implant that fickleness into God, again, is challenging, but I don't think that it lands in a way that is false.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus, on the other hand, is not an idea man.
Mm-hmm.
He's a caretaker.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to move on to the next thing. He wants to preserve and care for the things that already are.
Mm-hmm.
And that, again, is the contrast between the characters, and maybe even the contrast between the two testaments.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But as far as God as sort of an inventor, but the comic highlights God's miscalculations and errors in how he set things up. Because he talks about, I'll make sex the way that babies are made, and they'll enjoy it, so they'll do it more. And then Lucifer's there, not yet the fallen angel, saying, well, won't that make, for overpopulation? He says, I know, I'll make the animals eat each other, and as a way to reduce the population. But then we have Jesus telling a small group of followers that the whole project of Earth was doomed by the fact that sex was the way to increase population and violence was the way to reduce it. He's this that kind of doomed the whole project. Maybe. I mean, that's a way of looking at it, I guess.
It is. When I read that line too, like I thought, is he being too obvious here? But it's like, is this sophistry? Yeah, maybe a little bit, but also, like, sex and violence are that's the lizard brain. If you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, it's the earliest urges, that and territoriality.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a certain fatalism that goes into that because those urges predate the existence of humanity.
Well, yeah, that causes me to think, so Russell is approaching this from the point of view of kind of making some assumptions about like God and Jesus exist and the world was created in this way. And I don't think that this comic has so far mentioned anything like, evolution or, scientific theory about how the world was created. And, but yeah, so if you mentioned that that's lizard brain thinking, but in kind of the biblical narrative, there was no sort of intermediate between, there's no evolution from microscopic organisms to humans over millions of years. It's just poof. And so, we're still making some religious assumptions in this. It'd be interesting if he brought evolution into this and sort of contrasted, the worldviews of science versus religion.
Yeah, no, you're quite right. He certainly is conceptualizing God as a sole creator, as more consistent with the intelligent design theory. Mm-hmm. But it's not intelligent design so much as it's whimsical design, as portrayed. I think.
Yeah, that's true.
The logos of intention of intelligent design is replaced with something else, maybe it's not pathos, but
I mean, I guess it's the way that you would do it. I mean, it's a commentary on religion. Take some assumptions of religion and then comment on them. But yeah, I think it would be interesting if there's like a second 6 issues, if he brought that discussion into this. Don't know if he will, but.
Yeah, neither do I. It is somewhat counter to his character of God, but we'll see. He can probably find a seamless way to sneak it in there somehow.
Mm-hmm. Well, he's crammed so many different ideas into these 6 issues that I don't doubt that he could wedge it in there if he wanted to.
I expect him to try and do something with aliens. I think in the background of one panel we saw an angel that had a big green squiddy-looking Cthulhu face, and Sunstar is an alien like Superman as well. Mm-hmm. So maybe he'll go that route.
Yeah, well, the relationship of Sunstar, or I guess his other name is Ken. Sheila is sort of interesting that since Ken is not human, they can't legally get married, and they're trying to have a baby and somehow they can't. I don't know, is that because he's not human? Didn't quite catch that.
They were not explicit about that, but that was my assumption. There's incompatible DNA or something along those lines.
Yeah, so the sort of one of the many subplots in this comic is that they're trying to adopt, and that has an effect on the overall story several times. But then, yeah, at the end, I don't know, we might as well. I'm just going to put a spoiler warning on this whole episode. That God at the end, when he's talking about how he likes. Bowling is kind of a symbolism of, the pins get knocked down and then there's a reset and everything's fine again. But, he's kind of cheerful, and you're talking about that, the attitude that God brings in when he's on the page, and congratulating Sheila for getting a strike or whatever. And then as a wedding present, apparently he causes Sheila to be pregnant. So this God has some generosity. He's not always grumpy. But yeah, so now I guess in the second 6 issues or whatever, we'll have pregnancy and I imagine the 6th issue, the birth of a baby. So I'm that's certainly going to be one factor in the next set of issues.
Yeah, no doubt that they were teeing that up for for further payoff.
Well, we've talked longer than it seems like we have. But anything else we should touch on here?
I think we got a lot of the meat out of this one. I think we went to the stuff that matters at the expense of some of the lesser orbiting content.
Yeah, just to mention also, one of the things that he mentioned in that interview was mass incarceration and, throwing people in jail is the way to solve problems. And sure enough, Jesus gets thrown in jail like almost instantly when he's left alone, when Sunstar has to run off to take care of an emergency, gets in a fight, people beating him up, then he's thrown in jail. And of course, he's treated like he's impersonating Jesus, because no one would believe that he's actually Jesus. Just
and he's about to be murdered with a spork by the local Aryan Brotherhood. Right, yeah, in jail. He's almost stabbed with a spork. The other guy takes the spork for him. I'm surprised that would actually draw blood. Yeah, it gave me flashbacks of Sons of Anarchy. I watched too much of that show.
Well, anyway, we could probably find more things to talk about if I could dig through my mess of notes here. But yeah, I think this was good. So maybe we can come back when the other 6 issues come out or whatever there's going to be.
I would love to. I hope that he pays this off in a challenging and meaningful way.
Yeah.
Second Coming is published by Ahoy Comics. Support this and all our shows by joining us on Patreon. Our tiers start at just $2 a month. Pledge at least $4 a month to get our Patreon-only series Spider-Man 1963 and Tim Catches Up with the MCU. Go to patreon.com/deconcomics to join the fun. Our theme is from bensound.com. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and Mulele and I will critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. Next week on Deconstructing Comics, Kumar and Emmett review Emily Carroll's spooky collection, Through the Woods. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.